Good morning, everybody. I'm Sid Milkis from the Miller Center and the Department of Politics, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Miller Center webinar on the state of the presidency, a timely and important discussion. And we're lucky to have two excellent panelists joining us today. I want to welcome Jamelle Bouie, who is a columnist for the New York Times and a political analyst for CBS News. He covers campaigns, elections, national affairs, and culture. And Jamelle is a truly gifted and knowledgeable journalist. I like to think I know a fair amount about the subjects Jamelle writes about, but I always learn a great deal from his columns, especially those which explore the deep historical roots of partisan politics, partisan rancor. And he's done some really great work on the 19th century. And we're very proud at the University of Virginia that Jamelle is a graduate of our distinguished political and social thought program. Let me also welcome James Marone, who is the John Hazen White Professor of Political Science at Brown University. Jim is a brilliant writer and a great scholar, and he's a wonderful friend. We've known each other a long time. He's published a whole lot of important books and articles, most recently this one. Is that showing up okay, Jim?
It looks great.
It's called The Republic of Wrath, How American Politics Turned Tribal, From George Washington to Donald Trump. That covers most of it. That's my basic book in 2020. As the title suggests, this is a rip-roaring analysis of the major partisan developments in American political history with special attention to immigration and race. So welcome, Jamelle. Welcome, Jim. Before we start the heavy lifting here, I want to remind our audience that we welcome your questions and your comments at any time during the discussion. We have a tremendous turnout today, so thank you for joining us. And please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll get to as many of your questions and comments as possible. So Jim, let's start with you on a big topic that keeps political scientists awake at night and worried the framers. Do you think the presidency has become too powerful? Do you think we've arrived at a kind of presidency-centered democracy that is dangerous for a people that thinks they're engaged in self-government?
So there's three questions there, Sid, and the answers are yes, yes, and yes. Tocqueville, who's famous French author, came to the United States, wrote a book, 1835. He has a fascinating reading of the American Constitution. He goes institution by institution, and about the president. It's kind of a lost commentary, but it's very penetrating. He says about the president had, in 1835, almost royal prerogatives, which he has no opportunity to use. But, says Tocqueville, when America's interests become interwoven with other great powers, then we'll see an awfully powerful president. Awfully is my words, not his. But that proved prophetic, I think. You can't have 750 military installations around the globe and not have an extremely powerful president right from the start. Our presidents travel like emperors. I mean, when Donald Trump goes to London, he carries with him 1,000 people. When Obama goes to Senegal, a whole aircraft carrier comes with over 100 vehicles unloaded from it. The presidency's powers have been exacerbated, let's be blunt, by the collapse of Congress. Congress no longer functions as a legislative body using regular order. And so we have lots to talk about that, but that combination of an inherently powerful presidency, we're just faced with constant problems. What will we do about immigration? What should we do about the ICE police force as it worries about immigrants? What should we do about international politics? The Constitution would put questions like that before Congress, Congress has abandoned its constitutional roles for reasons we can discuss. Partisanship has made regular order almost impossible, and all the power has devolved on the president. And that is both true of Democrats and Republicans. Our constitutional order is under terrific strain now. Indeed, it may very well be cracking. And I don't see any way out of that. So we're going to have to adjust this whole system, I believe, on the fly, particularly after the last election, which really ought to send shivers up our back for the fate of the republic. And much to say about that, but I'll stop there and hope we can pick those issues up.
Of course, changing a whole system in our political system is a difficult matter, particularly when it comes to constraining the presidency, I think. Jamel, you have any thoughts on our elected monarchy?
No, I agree wholeheartedly with James here. There's a degree to which, right, the growth of global U.S. power after the Second World War kind of puts us on a bit of path dependency with regards to a strong and dominant presidency. I don't think you can kind of disentangle that. The fact that we made the decision to put the use of nuclear weapons kind of in the sole hand of the presidency also adds to that. But even within that framework, it is abundantly clear that the Congress has essentially abdicated its role within government, that it defers as many questions as it can. It hands off questions, hands off issues to the presidency and to the judiciary. Right? I think that there's this two parts to this. It's a very strong presidency and a very strong judiciary that is increasingly in a outright policymaking mode, as much as judges will deny that that's what they're doing. And so, I think that the presidency is very strong, it's dominant, but that has as much to do with other institutional actors deciding that they don't want the trouble of making decisions, or other larger structural forces that has pushed Congress away from, as James said, regular order, regular engagement with sort of the issues before the country, and force the other major institutional actors to kind of take up the slack, right? I think you saw this during the Obama administration, and immigration is a good example. It was abundantly clear that President Obama would have preferred a congressional bill to do something about immigration, that as much as the presidency does have wide-ranging authority with the execution of immigration law, with discretion with regards to who is deported, who is not, who gets to stay, et cetera, that all of this is very unstable, right? It's recently, over the past 2 months, 3 months, there's been a lot of conversation about ending the Senate filibuster. And one of the rejoinders to those who say that we should is that, well, if you do that, there'll be these wild swings in policy from administration. But arguably, it's precisely because Congress doesn't really make laws anymore, and the executive is doing all the work and is doing essentially making law through executive action, that we are having wild swings of policy, because there's no, we swing from Trump essentially ending immigration to Biden opening it up. We swing from President Trump doing everything he can to undermine the Affordable Care Act to President Biden reversing that. The absence of congressional lawmaking is creating the conditions for the wide swings of policy that people rightfully bemoan, right? That we rightfully say we should look for ways to mitigate this and avoid it. So that's just a little elaboration on what James said, but I basically agree wholeheartedly here. I think, we have this very powerful presidency for a variety of reasons. And then we have I wouldn't go as far as say a rump Congress, but a Congress that is punching well below its weight class in terms of its institutional authority.
Jim, why do you think Congress is punching so below its weight class? Why is it forfeited so much?
For starters, it's an institution designed for collaboration, particularly the Senate. And if you have two parties that don't have two parties that are willing to collaborate, I think the whole process really breaks down. Treaties constitutionally require a 2/3 vote. You just can't imagine that. And part of why it's broken down, there's several reasons, but one of them is that elections have become so close that each party can win it all. In between 2000 and 2020, we have had 12 changes in House, Senate, or presidency. That breaks the old record of 10 between 1876 and 1896. So all the incentives are don't cooperate. And that's true on both sides of the aisle. Don't cooperate and try to win it all next time. Normally, traditionally, there has been a dominant party, the Roosevelt coalition, for example. Once the Roosevelt coalition is in place and Eisenhower comes along, and when his brother writes him, God, you got to get rid of Social Security, Eisenhower says a party that gets rid of Social Security will be a party that won't win another election for years to come. I'm not going to get rid of Social Security. He was acting as a soft Democrat. Likewise, when Reagan takes over, he's the majority that, along with Southern Democrats, the liberals kind of go along. They complain, but there's a clear majority. Now we don't have a majority party. Both parties are equally divided. And to get partisan for a second, and this might generate some commentary, the Republican Party has learned that it doesn't need to be a policy party. Indeed, it can't agree on policy. So it has become a party of enormous complaint about a culture it feels is getting away from it. And that has turned it into a party. When was the last time, I think 1840, that a party did not even write a platform? It's no longer a party of policymaking. And when you have a set of institutions that require Congress, when you have a Congress that requires two parties, and you only have one that's really interested in the issues of governance, and another interested really in lamenting the culture, it's very hard to operate that institution. So it's incentives, and I think it's also the evolution of the two parties and their almost complete inability now to coordinate policy. I'm not a fan of bipartisanship. I think it's a myth. Those of you who are hoping for bipartisanship, I've got a rant. I will give you later in this program. But having said all that, you need some. And the two parties, neither one, have really the capacity to work with one another, and that just ruins Congress.
It's interesting, Jim, that when the Republicans were interested in government during the Trump presidency, they looked to Trump to carry out, to advance most of the causes they cared most about through executive orders, with the exception of the tax bill that they passed. So almost everything he did with respect to immigration, which was the most important issue for his administration, he did administratively. Or climate change was another example of this.
As Jamel says, we basically are lurching from party to power, taking over the presidency. But notice what this does. It puts a huge premium on a team that really knows how to run the administrative state. If you have a newcomer come to Washington with proudly no government experience, they're going to have a hard time getting through the court system because they just don't know how to operate the administrative state. And Biden's great advantage right now is he's got a team who's been there before, and they know all the boring stuff, like how you put an executive order into place, running it past OMB twice, et cetera, et cetera. That's something that the wonks who are listening in should be cheering. We've got actually the rise of the bureaucratic process as the power behind the power.
So Jamel, we have a question from Gary here. He asks, what possible reforms, you mentioned, what possible reforms could fix some of these challenges that you and Jim have brought up? Now, you talked about the filibuster, and that's a really interesting and provocative thing to consider. Are there other things that that you can point to that might make things a little bit better?
So I actually want to get to something Jim said, and I'll answer the question in the course of getting to this thing, which is that this well-taken point about the closeness of election. Right? We're kind of in this unprecedented period where you have regular partisan changeover, where the margins in elections are actually quite slim. We're not talking, in national elections, we're not talking landslides, and even in Senate and statewide elections, it's a few states really where you see like landslide victories. Like partisan competition is actually pretty close across the board. Um, but I don't think it's just the closeness of partisan competition that is at issue here. I think it's the composition of the respective coalitions themselves, which is that they're polarized not just along racial lines, not just along educational lines increasingly, but along geographic lines. That one party is predominantly the party of cities and suburbs, and the other party is predominantly the party of rural areas and exurbs. And that geographic polarization, which I think the cultural polarization kind of follows from it, creates a situation where it's not as if there is a faction of Republican lawmakers who represent cities, right? And so even with partisan incentives, even with everything else, they might still have a reason to work with their Democratic counterpart to represent cities. Or on the flip side, there aren't that many Democrats who represent rural areas. And so the incentive to work together with their Republican counterparts on rural issues isn't as strong as it might have been when the coalitions were both geographically very mixed. And I think that geographical polarization then feeds into sort of the institutional features of American democracy, that you can win most power in Washington without winning a majority of votes if you control essentially the largest land masses in terms of districts. If you control the western states, if you control rural areas, then you're more or less 2/3 of the way from the start, from winning the House, winning the Senate, and then possibly winning the White House. And so for the Republican Party in particular, you have this geographical cultural polarization, and then you have a real recognition that you don't need to win a majority of votes really ever in a national election to win the majority of power. And so there literally is no reason for at least the Republican Party to want to adopt any kinds of norms of compromise or forbearance, right? Because you can win it all without doing it. And when you also have, a party whose policy platform such that it is really just is rolling back existing regulations, it's rolling back kind of as much of the New Deal administrative state as possible. It is kind of entrenching yourself in the judiciary to act as a bulwark against liberal lawmaking, activism, what have you. Then you do have this kind of perfect storm of, we don't really need policies. Geographic cultural polarization does the work in terms of getting our voters out. And we don't really need to reach out to voters for whom there might be real policy issues they want to see addressed from a conservative perspective, because look, they all live in the cities, doesn't matter. Who cares? We can win power without them. So I think this gets to possible solutions. And I think you basically have to look for ways institutionally to break the polarization and to force both parties to have to compete for all votes. So, right, this is all like a long shot, right? But think about something like the Electoral College, simply getting rid of it and having a national popular vote election. I think that the common view is that this would, put all presidential elections in the hands of New York, California, Texas, and Illinois. But most voters don't live in those states, right? There's a roughly equal number of voters in rural, exurban, kind of suburban areas and big cities and metro areas. And in a national popular vote election, the state borders don't really matter anymore. It's sort of just where the voters are. And if all of a sudden, there's an incentive for Democrats to invest a lot of money into turning out rural Democrats and a lot of incentive for Republicans to invest a lot of money in turning out urban Republicans, then you might see some changes in how they kind of talk about politics, how they address issues. I think the same goes, there's a political scientist, Lee Drutman, who has a great book called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. It's kind of a case for multi-party democracy. And he makes, I think, a pretty compelling argument that looking for ways to make it easier for third and fourth parties to compete in American elections might do some of the work of breaking the polarization, because there are places, there are issues where that kind of exists outside of the partisan divide somewhat. There are places where it is possible to find issue-based cooperation if the kind of political incentives were a little different. And there's just the simple thing that multiple parties would scramble up the ability of one side or the other to think that they can win it all. I mean, I think there's something to be said, right, for to get to Jim's point. We're in this unusual situation politically where there's actually a fair amount of certainty about political outcomes, that that at some point in like a 4 or 5 year span you're going to have a good share of power, and the certainty, I think, encourages some of this dysfunctional behavior. But if at no point really you can kind of like accurately predict who's going to win what, I think that does change the calculations. If you can't say, if there are 4 parties in the field and playing the game, you don't really know what the particular majority is going to look like, and I think that ends up changing how you act as a political actor, especially within an institution like Congress. Mm-hmm. But I think my kind of big point here is, I think the problems here are as much about kind of the shape and contours of two-party competition right now as they are anything else. And that's a hard problem to solve. It's a hard nut to crack. But I think that if you can make headway into solving it, you might get somewhere into fixing some of the problems in Congress. Now, as far as Congress not doing anything, I mean, that's a whole other set of issues. I think you can look to the concentration of power in congressional leadership. You can look to this is a symbiotic relationship, but kind of the incentive to not, the election of highly ideological lawmakers who see their jobs as messaging and not necessarily as policymaking or sort of representation of their geographical area, is part of this. And I can't decide if that's all downstream of the big structural problems or upstream. I don't know how this metaphor is going to go, or if they all kind of exist all together in a bundle and it's hard to disentangle it.
Yeah,
it's a lake or a swamp.
Right. Yeah. So Jim, Jamel's given us a lot to chew on there. Electoral College, third parties, swimming upstream or downstream.
Well, there is a lot.
We have somebody, one of our guests also and this question's often asked about gerrymandering. What role that?
Yes. Let me just comment. I think the first comment to make is, I think it'll give us a little headspace to realize, to make big changes like the ones Jamel is suggesting, if we realize that this was not meant to be a minority run, a country where a minority of the voters get to rule. There's a vague sense that the idea that a president who won the most votes, for example, has lost in the past. But though in the 19th century, that was extremely anomalous. Yes, Andrew Jackson lost in 1824, but he came roaring back in 1828. Yes, Grover Cleveland lost to Harrison, but he came roaring back the next election. They were all one-offs. The idea that we have a systematic minority rule, for exactly the reason Jamel says, urban-rural, there's only one feature of the constitutional history that we've seen that before, and that's the advantage that slavery had with the 3/5 rule. And between roughly 1820 and 1850, there was really dominance of the South. But that's not a very good precedent to follow. The idea that one party would get a majority vote once for the president since 1988, and yet, as Jamel says, the elections are all very close because of the rules. That was never intended. So as we think about changes, I think it helps us to think big. If we think, look, that old Constitution, which people tend to want to cling to, let's not make these big changes, that was never intended. The idea that one class of voters, the rural class, is just going to dominate the system. I would say two more things. One, when I was studying the history of American elections for this latest book, I was stunned at how much cheating there was. In the very first contested election in 1800, 7 states changed the rules. There were only 16 states. They're all changing the rules. And what's clear is we need a clear set of electoral rules rather than the scramble to change the rules after every election. And we need to make sure that everyone votes. I'll give you a radical reform. I want to go the Australian way and say everybody must vote. It's worse. It's a worse violation of the public weal if you don't vote than if you park in the wrong place. And it ought to be treated the same way as a small violation of the public good. If we expanded the vote, if we really had everyone voting, and there were some hints of this in the last election, I think a lot of our problems would begin to diminish. We need a big electorate. And to Jamel's point about the Electoral College, originally, the way the Electoral College worked was that it went by state. You divided the electoral votes by the percentage of the vote you got. And I think that's how it ought to be. It used to be, Jefferson was all in from Virginia. He was all in on splitting up the electoral vote the way the population went. And then he realized, wait, if we do that in 1800, when I'm running against John Adams, Adams will get one electoral vote from Virginia. And so he writes this letter to James Monroe, your governor, and he says, hey, let's change the rules. Let's have winner take all so I can get all the votes. He's perfectly explicit about it. Never mind my principles. Let's change the rules. Make systematic rules about elections that press the most possible number of people voting. It shouldn't be hard. Technological. You turn 18, hey, you can own a gun and you can vote. Done. And I would divide the Electoral College. I think getting away from it is a big stretch, but I would divide it by the percentage of the vote you got. Now, Trump takes a third of New York, he gets a third of the delegates. And that might really open things up without the onerous part of a constitutional amendment. I'll say one last thing, and that is the surprising thing, we have never constitutionally mandated a right to vote in this country. There is no right to vote. As the Supreme Court majority said in the Bush v. Gore, the individual citizen has no constitutional right to vote for the electors of the president of the United States. The state can give you the right, the Constitution doesn't. Here's my first constitutional amendment. Every citizen has the right to vote for national and state and local offices of the state where they reside. They tried that one in 1869. It was the first draft of the 15th Amendment. It only got 5 votes in the Senate because the Republicans in the North wanted to discriminate against the Irish, and the Democrats in the West wanted to discriminate against Asians. And so that went nowhere. But I think it's time to call that amendment back. And a lot will follow once we give everybody a constitutional right to vote. Shocking, but it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think, Jim, a couple of states are considering bills that would return to the state legislatures the power to select electors, taking it away from the popular vote.
Yes, that this is a multiple iteration game. And the reason I really fear for American democracy, if you're a glass half full kind of person, you think, wow, the system really held. Those 50 different electoral systems, God bless them, the Republicans and the Democrats, they counted votes fairly. But as the boring political scientists like to say, this is a multiple iteration game. And I fear that the lesson that Republicans in particular have drawn from this is, you lose your office if you stand up against your own party in the counting of votes and all the little interstices of the system that no one ever noticed before. The people in Michigan who rubber stamp the election and say, yeah, looks good to us, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, no one ever knew about that. But put a demagogue in office who insists on looking at every piece. What's Michigan going to do next time? Are the 2 Republicans going to rubber stamp what seems to be a clear outcome? I doubt it, because they'll know that their political careers are over. So I really worry this whole spate of changes that are coming from the realization that the process itself can be used to overturn electoral votes for your party. That is really dangerous. And I worry what it's going to look like down the line in the next election and the following election, particularly where elections are close. So we're dreaming big, Jamel and I, and you said here about changes, but the status quo is getting really I'm very fretful about where we are. So you can be glass half full. Hey, we dodged a bullet on this one, but I'm in Jamel's swamp on this. I really worry what the rules will look like in the next election and the election after that.
Jamel, we have someone here who wants to talk a little more explicitly about the multitude of voter suppression laws in the states, and I know you've thought and written about the importance of a big Voter Rights Act, and I wonder if you think so far not much leadership has come from the White House on this issue, and that's understandable for now. But do you think the Biden administration will go big on voting rights, and do you think this is the issue that might push the Democrats to get rid of the filibuster, or will they get resistance from the couple of moderates in the Democratic Party in the Senate, like Joe Manchin?
I hope that this is the issue that pushes pushes Democrats to, if not get rid of the filibuster, then reform it to allow a vote for voting rights legislation. And I hope the White House really takes the lead on this. I think we're in a situation analogous to that of the 1880s and 1890s, where states are beginning to try to lock in partisan dominance by kind of harshly restricting the electorates whatever way they can. The avenues for doing it are less broad than they used to be, but you can still do quite a bit of damage, right? You can still do quite a bit. And with close elections, marginal changes can have these big impacts, and you can kind of just build on your restrictions after that. And then, as now, kind of the only backstop, there's no way to stop this, is through federal action, through the federal government exercising its constitutional authority to regulate federal elections. It's noteworthy that Republican lawmakers opposed to the Voting Rights, the For the People Act, the HR 1 bill, the line they've taken is that this is unconstitutional. They want to create the idea that it's somehow untoward for the federal government to act in this way, but it's right there in play. Like of the things that the Constitution plainly says, one of them is that Congress can regulate the means of the election of its officers, and I think that's an important step that needs to be taken to prevent voter suppression. This one thing I've been thinking, I was thinking about the last couple of minutes, was that when we talk about the Constitution in public life, we always are implicitly talking about the 1787 Constitution, right? The one crafted by the founding fathers. But I think there ought to be greater awareness, and we ought, and progressives in particular, need to talk more about what I'll call the Constitution of 1870, right? The Constitution that includes the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, which do, I think, completely recontextualize what that document is. That kind of, even if there is no direct right to vote, that those amendments kind of set out an egalitarian constitution, one that its aspiration is greater and more expansive political participation, that sets out a government that has obligations to the people that it's over. It's not just we have an obligation to be good Republican citizens, but lowercase r Republican citizens, but that the government has an obligation to us as well. And I think that thinking about the Constitution in those terms can help, to borrow from Jim's language, clear the headspace a bit for thinking about the kind of reforms necessary to protect democracy. That these aren't some extra constitutional attempts to overturn the system. It really is trying to live up to the values and aspirations put forth in those amendments. And so I hope the White House, to go back to the beginning of the question, I hope the White House takes HR 1, takes the Voting Rights Act kind of revision as an opportunity to really take the lead on this and to impress upon the public that this is important. One reason I'm a little optimistic here is that to compare back to the end of the 19th century, there was a real argument within the Republican Party, which is sort of nominally the party of voting rights, and African American voting rights in particular. There's a real debate within that party about what was the best way to establish an electoral beachhead in the South. Do you continue doubling down, or do you continue on the path of protecting Black rights, even though there's so much friction there? The Northern public has very little appetite at this point for sort of heavy-handed federal intervention in the South. Or do you look for ways to appeal to Southern whites and kind of build a Southern Republican Party that way? And it was the latter argument that ultimately won out. But in the present, the Democratic Party seems to recognize that the key to its national future is, in fact, the enfranchisement and continued protection of voting rights of most Americans. That even if it's not true that the more people vote, the more likely it is Democrats win. I think one of the ironies of last year's election is that it very clearly demonstrated that Republicans can compete very well in high turnout elections, but the Republican Party has so internalized this view that it can't. Like, smart election analysts on the left do not believe the demographics or destiny argument anymore, but Republicans appear to believe the demographics or destiny argument. And so that is sort of leading them on this path. But even if that isn't the case, Democrats do really rely on low propensity voters. They do rely on turnout and activism and engagement from African Americans, from Hispanic Americans, from working class whites, even though they're not winning, the lion's share with them, it's still an important part of the constituency. So the fact that there is no viable national Democratic Party without strong voting rights and without strong voting protections makes me optimistic that this is the thing that will get Democrats in the Senate, especially, to move. I mean, Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona, who's been a vocal opponent of ending the filibuster, so a vocal supporter of the filibuster, can say as much as she wants about that, but it's also true that she did not win a big landslide victory. That her win as well depends on the ability of Arizona Democrats to turn out their base, which depends in turn on an Arizona that has fair electoral and voting rules. And so when you start to look at it in those terms, just direct political incentives, I think there's a real reason for Democrats to go down the path. And if nothing else, the last Democratic president, the still very popular Barack Obama, said outright at the funeral of John Lewis that Democrats should abolish the filibuster to pass voting rights protections. And I have a feeling that what we may be witnessing right now in the Senate is basically kabuki, as key actors kind of rhetorically get their way to saying, I regretfully have to support this dramatic reform to the filibuster that may keep it in name, but ultimately leaves it pretty ineffectual. I think that's kind of the likely outcome, not the most likely outcome, but a very possible outcome right now.
What you say about Republican recalcitrance is really interesting, because Donald Trump did better with African Americans and Hispanics in 2020 than he did in 2016. And I think demographics are definitely not destiny with Hispanics. I think that's the future of American partisanship and alignments, I think, is very much dependent on mobilization of the Latino vote. So Jim, I want to just shift gears ever so slightly and ask you about this. Let's talk directly a bit about the partisanship of the presidency, because one of the striking things in recent American history, it seems to me, we talked about how the presidential power has become dangerous, but what I think makes it especially dangerous is this merger we've seen between presidential prerogative and partisanship. And you write in your book about how the presidency has been pulled into the vortex, I think that's how you put it, of partisanship. And this, you start with George Washington and his hope about the presidency being above partisanship and moderating it. It never really has been, but it seems like the presidency, particularly, since the Obama presidency, has been really deeply influenced by partisanship.
It has been a step-by-step process for sure. George Washington hated partisanship. He just ranted about it. But pretty soon he started feeling like the Democratic Republicans, as we now call them, they were out to get him. And he got pretty pissed off at them. He was a partisan. Jefferson, as you guys are from University of Virginia, you know this, but he once announced that if I could not go to heaven, but with a party, I would not go there at all. I'd rather burn in hell than join a party. Of
course, he was
strong words from the man who started the first party, which was you're about to say. But it has been interesting to watch. You could look at the story of the American presidency, Sid, from time to time as they've been pulled in to this partisanship. I mean, going back to Harry Truman, you know, he was an inarticulate president in the shadow of Franklin Roosevelt. He used to say, I'm a dub at public speaking. But in his 1948 campaign, his famous re-election campaign, the Give Them Hell Harry campaign, he discovered his voice. And people loved this. You know, his staff would go out in the crowd and get the crowd jimmied up, you know, give him hell, Harry. And he did. And when he won re-election, the expectation was he would really start militating for his policies, national health insurance primarily among them. His supporters begged him to go out and make speeches, and he felt he couldn't do that. He never really became a forceful advocate for his policies. Here we were at the dawn of the new atomic age, and he just felt constrained. So he was a very unsuccessful in his second term. He got nothing through Congress, partially because he refused to advocate. So what a difference there is now. And the lesson of Harry Truman was, you'd better get out there, because it's hard enough to get things through Congress. And you can see president by president, as you said, drawn into the vortex of politics. But, you know, you got to get things done in a political system. We don't really have the luxury in the 21st century to have this slow-moving Tudor political system that throws back really to the 18th century. There's lots of things that need addressing, and that has pushed the presidents into advocates for their positions. There are parties that are no longer strong enough to do it. There's no other force like the president, and they've discovered, to their chagrin, as Truman did, the dangers of standing back and letting all the checks and balances of our system block reform. But I would add one more thing, and this picks up on what Jamel said, that there is a real difference between winning policies, and as I've just said, that draws the president into politics, and asserting the right to vote. That is on a different order, I think. And right now, a couple of political scientists like Hacker and Pearson, they call it Calvin ball. And I don't mean John Calvin, I mean Calvin and Hobbes. That you remember Calvin, when he played ball, he just made up the rules as he went along. Well, we now have a political system that's like that. So even if you want to keep the filibuster for policy issues, I would say the Democrats really ought to really think about, let's get the rules of voting straight, and then we can go back to bashing one another. But here, one last point. Here's the great irony of having wide voting rules, wide open voting rules. I believe it will save the Republican Party. This is something Jamel just dropped briefly in a half sentence, and I want to really underscore that half sentence. It goes back, as Jamel and you both said about the 2020 election. The Republican Party now finds itself in a very difficult bind. And I'm sure many people listening are well-meaning, intelligent Republicans. My dad was a Republican and never voted for a Democrat in his life. Still a great guy. In 1964, however, that party, the Republican Party, made a bargain with the devil. Well-meaning libertarian conservatives like Barry Goldwater, and he was in no way a racist, highly admired, But he understood that he was creating a new coalition, and if he was going to go anywhere, he had to look the other way as the ardent segregationists came on board. And starting in the 1964 election, solidified by Richard Nixon in 68 and 72, it became a party of genuine, honest, conservative people whose major focus is liberty, as they see it, and people who have racial anxieties or nativist anxieties. And the two groups have quietly lived with one another. Democrats or liberals are often pointing out all the dog whistles and stuff, but the truth of the matter is that party could get away with not too much dog whistling to its racially racist, I'm just going to come out and say it, wing. And so the two parts just lived quietly together. If you were a young Republican, and then Trump comes along as people who identify as white, as that vote diminishes over time, he realized, I gotta squeeze that last white vote. And he didn't use dog whistles, he used a megaphone, as we all know. If you're a young Republican, I talk to my young Republican students all the time, your most ardent wish is to take this party away from that wing that sort of snuck in 1964. Frankly, it was invited in 1964 as the Republican Party became the party of Northern conservatives and former Southern Democrats. If we had really widespread voting, we would see an incentive in the Republican Party to win back a vote that it lost in the 1930s, the black vote, to win back the immigrant votes that it lost over the course of the 20th century, win back the Asian vote, which Asian Americans voted for Bob Dole. It was in the Republican Party until 1996, just lost it after 2000. Widespread voting would give the Republicans real incentives to remake their base, to throw off, I think, this white anxiety, nativist part of the party. It's always been part of American politics, used to be part of the Democratic Party, now part of the Republican Party. But if you're a young Republican out there, that's what you need. And the way to do it is to say, let's have lots of people voting and then try to reconstruct the base. I talk to my Republican students about this all the time, and they just, that's the image. And there could be a new Republican Party, and that new Republican Party would change everything we're saying. All our negativity in this session would begin to shift if the Republican Party became a genuinely open party. And good heavens, we might have seen the first stirrings of that in the 2000 election, but just the first stirrings. And it would be marvelous to see young Republicans take over and drive out the party of their Fox granddads.
Jamel, Jim and I deal with young people all the time. That's our job. You are young. So I want you comment on the youth. In the future, we have a member of our audience who asks, what about the millennials? And what does that say about the American democracy going forward?
What about the millennials? I mean, I think the first thing to recognize, it's just worth saying, is that at this point, like the typical millennial, like the median millennial is like in their late 20s and early 30s. That millennials don't no longer mean 19, 20, 21-year-olds. Millennials mean at the oldest end, 39, 40-year-olds, so people basically approaching middle age. And then on the younger end, people finishing up their 20s and entering their 30s. So we're talking about adults at this point, established adults. And I think that the impact of millennials in American politics remains to be seen in a major way, but I think we're getting some inkling of what that impact might look like just in the leftward turn of the Democratic Party. That the Democratic Party is sort of unquestionably more liberal than it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, I'd even say 10 years ago. Right, just the we've now had two Democratic presidents entering office having to pass recovery bills, and just comparing the two recovery bills tells you a lot about the trajectory of the Democratic Party. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 was $787 billion. It wasn't even, the proposal didn't even hit $1 trillion for moderate Democratic fear of being seen as too profligate. It contained a large number of tax cuts, about a third of it were tax cuts. The direct payments it made were basically hidden from view so that people, that people wouldn't think that Democrats were spending willy-nilly. It is in some ways a very progressive bill, just because it's a big stimulus bill and had many investments in infrastructure and in clean energy, et cetera, et cetera. But it also reflects very much the policy consensus that hadn't moved too far from where it was in the Clinton years, and certainly not too far from where it was in the Bush years, where it became where it stayed sort of very much in the middle. And then this current bill, I spent a while yesterday kind of going through its provisions, and everywhere you look, there are new direct payments, new kinds of spending. It's more than twice the size, $1.9 trillion. It has direct cash benefits in what really is a total repudiation of Clinton-era welfare politics. It really represents a shift to the left, and critically, every single Democrat voted for it, right? The most conservative Democrat in the Senate, Joe Manchin, voted for it. The most liberal Democrat in the Senate voted for it. And I think that reflects how the party has changed. And I think that reflects kind of the influence of millennials, that millennials whose kind of formative political experiences are in order, 9/11, the financial collapse, and now the pandemic, have a kind of different relationship to government on the whole. There are obviously a lot of conservative millennials, but I think on the whole, it's a different relationship to government. It's a desire for government that actually does something for them. I think a great deal of Bernie Sanders' appeal to millennial voters in the 2016 and 2020 elections was simply that he was unapologetically for government doing things for people. And I think that is already influencing the Democratic coalition. I think it's going to influence where the Republican coalition goes as well. The Republican Party doesn't quite have a sense of what it thinks, how it thinks the economy ought to be organized, or what it thinks the government should do. There's still sort of the Reaganism is still very much a part of the party. Cut regulations, cut taxes. In my view, redistribute wealth up to the wealthy. Mitch McConnell has proposed a total end to the estate tax, which is sort of, to me, kind of like the perfect example of what that kind of economic policy making is. And while there actually isn't too much dissension from that view within the Republican Party, there are on the margins Republicans saying, well, maybe we should spend more on family benefits. Maybe we should spend more on child benefits. Mitt Romney, whose 2012 campaign was sort of, the embodiment of zombie Reaganism, right, has proposed a child allowance program that is more, I think, a better program than the one that is in this relief bill in terms of its impact on child poverty, in terms of its policy design, the whole gamut. So millennials, I think they're going to, because of their experiences in a stagnant economy, and an economy that, even when it's growing, doesn't provide the kinds of opportunities it did for their, much less their parents and grandparents, even their older siblings, right? Like if you happen to have, if you're 30 and you have a 40-year-old sibling, that 40-year-old sibling would have grown up in a better economy than you did. I think all of this is going to make a big impact in American politics, and the same goes for the Generation Z or Zoomers, or however you call them, that they too have come to adulthood in a United States defined by deep inequality and a real lack of opportunity, and that's only going to have a big impact on American politics. Sort of the issue, to go back to what I said at the very beginning, is that in a healthy political system, there'd be an incentive for the Republican Party as a whole to really try to compete for these voters. But because our political system allows the Republican Party to win power without really having to do that kind of competition, it throws things completely out of whack. And the last thing I'll say is that, for as much as I do think millennials and voters younger than millennials are going to have a considerable impact on American politics. And as a quick parenthetical, a direct example of this is that I think the first millennial member of the Senate, John Ossoff of Georgia, is like, if not for, I mean, you can go either, if not for Warnock's win or not for his win, but him being in the Senate is like arguably the reason this bill even happened, right? Sort of like he ran on voting for a big expansive relief bill. But for as much as that's true, there are also a lot of conservative millennials. There are also a lot of millennials very much shaped by the kind of cultural politics that define the Trump era. And so for as much as you can find, pro-Sanders, left-wing millennials or even moderate millennial voters who are still much more left-wing than their parents might have been, you can also find politicians like Madison Cawthorn of North Carolina, who is straight up reactionary, right? You can find Stephen Miller in the Trump administration is 34 years old, right? Sort of, there's still ideological divides. There still is going to be kind of reactionary racial politics, right? These things are still going to exist because the conditions that produce them aren't simply, partisanship and partisan politics. It's actual, deep structures of American life. So, right, as long as we have a very segregated society, we're going to have the kind of politics that arise out of segregated societies. And among that are the kind of, again, very reactionary, nativist, racist, cultural politics, and that's going to continue to endure. And it's not out of question, right, that this just is a part of American politics for quite a while. That now that the doors have been blasted open on doing this kind of politics, that it's just going to be with us.
So I just love talking to you guys, but sadly we're coming to an end here, and so I just wanted to ask you both to comment on how you think Biden's doing so far. We at the Miller Center think the beginning of a presidency is a very important part of the presidency. So, but I have to be like a cable news host and ask you to be rather. I love listening to the longer answers, but alas, we don't have time for that. So Jim, can you start and give us some of your?
Sure, I can hear the NPR music in the background. Obviously, Biden is doing fantastically. Lyndon Johnson used to say, "Every day I lose some power, even though I won a landslide. Every day I lose some power, I make an enemy." When was the last time someone got a bill this big through within the first 50 days? Extraordinary. I couldn't agree more about millennial politics moving things along. And I think what this bill signifies, and particularly the lack of coherent Republican opposition to it, is the end of the Ronald Reagan era. Reagan reacted against the equality of the period before his administration. We now, this bill marks, I think, the end of the hegemony, the dominance in both parties of Ronald Reagan thinking. The Democrats have slipped out from under it now. They're not going to just be a moon reflecting the era of big government is over. And Republicans are not quite sure how to react. And that lack of certainty, I think, is a suggestion that they themselves are moving into a new kind of format, not entirely a Reagan format. Pray to God that it is not a pure Trumpian format that picks up on the things Jamel just mentioned, racism and nativism, and that instead it's something that taps a better angel of our nature.
It's always good to hear Lincoln, the quote from Lincoln as we near the end. Jamel, do you think Biden has a chance to be a transformative president?
Yeah, I do. This relief bill is a real achievement. It is sort of, it's hard to overstate, I think, its potential impact on just sort of the economy and people's lives, but also what it signifies for the Democratic Party and its coalition. And I think, it appears that Biden's legislative agenda for these 2 years before the next midterms are a relief bill, an infrastructure bill, a green infrastructure bill specifically, a voting rights bill. I think those are the three.
And immigration.
And immigration, that's right, yes. If Biden can get a green infrastructure bill through, multi-trillion-dollar green infrastructure bill through, and a voting rights bill through, then we will be looking at a spate, even without the immigration bill, a spate of progressive lawmaking unseen since the Great Society, right? Like even the first 2 years of the Obama term were pretty productive in ways I think have kind of been lost. But this, in terms of scale, would even surpass that. And we'd be looking at something on the order of the early New Deal. So I think if Democrats, Biden has those ambitions. If Democrats in Senate can align themselves with those ambitions and do kind of whatever they need to do to get there, then I do think we'd be looking at a presidency that might be transformative in ways that I don't think I anticipated. Right? Like I didn't have this kind of view of what a Biden administration might be like. I think is clearly it's there. It's a potential that's there.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. It's been really delightful to have you here. Hope we can continue this discussion soon. And I want to thank my wonderful Miller Center colleagues for helping us do this. And so have a wonderful weekend, everybody. And we really appreciate the great audience and the great questions that they put forward. So long, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
This was a pleasure.
Thank you, Jim. Jamal.
Thanks. Hey, that was fun.
Hey.